Sometimes the problem is that you get what you want. And so in the case of the American or these United States, they got what they wanted. They got their independence, and then the problem was, how do we set up a government? And you're going to see that a lot of the things they did were in contrast or against what the king had been doing or what they had accused the king of. So for example, they were really concerned about laws, and they wanted representation, so they definitely wanted a Congress. So that's what they did. So they set up a Congress, but they had no executive branch and no judicial branch. It was just Congress. Now, each of the states, as you recall in the Declaration of Independence, they said they wanted to be independent states. And so they were going to be a union of independent states. And so these United States took an idea from the Iroquois Nation, where you had individual Indian tribes, the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Iroquois, and I think there's 5 or 6 in all. And each of those individual groups, tribes, worked together under what was called the Iroquois Nation. And so when they needed to work together, they did. And so this idea of confederation is one that the founders used to organize this new country that was going to be individual states working together. And articles are kind of like a list. What are the articles of clothing you're taking with you? Or what articles do you have in that drawer? So it just means, what's the stuff? What's the main idea? What are the things in the Confederation? So they're trying to bring the 13 colonies together, and they all agreed to send delegates to Congress, but that Congress had very, very limited things. It was just a Congress basically to make laws. They could declare war, they could appoint military officers. When it says they could coin money, they could make money, and they could manage foreign affairs, because they had to work together for that. But as I said, they had no executive branch, so they had no one to really organize things. They had a president that basically said, we're going to meet where and when. But it wasn't power or organization. They had no set judicial branch. They had just one vote per state. Size of the state didn't matter. And so right away, the states are sort of vying for attention and vying for power. And the big states are saying, we should have more power because we have more people. And the little states are saying, don't try to push me around. And so they're already having trouble with that. They had no common currency. That means they had no one money. So every state printed its own money. And so that's fine. If I'm in Virginia and I want to buy from somebody in Virginia, that's fine. But if I go over to Maryland, they'll say, I don't want Virginia money. I need Maryland money. And so it was hard. And it's a lot like the way Europe was before they got the euro. You had, if you were going to Europe and you were going to England and France and Spain, you needed to have different money for every single country. Europe got smart, and the European Union now has a euro. But the United States at that time, these United States, did not have a common currency. Congress also couldn't tax or regulate commerce among the states. They couldn't tax. Well, how in the world is a government going to do anything? They had no money to pay off their war debts. They had no money to do things for people like build roads. And so they had no power. They could beg, please, please, please give us money so we can pay off the debts that we got in the Revolutionary War, but they couldn't make anybody. And there's no group that can really work with states that are starting to argue over where's the boundary, or what do you do here, or if you come into my state, are you going to pay a tax to my state? So overall, we had a weak national government. And it says, the young nation, I have so many troubles. I'm weak, poor, and in debt. My paper money is useless. The Articles of Confederation do not support me. And we know that there were a couple things going on, because the foreign countries were taking advantage of us, in the sense that England was selling things to us, but they weren't buying things for us. And the troops from Britain hadn't left. They're sort of waiting over the border, ready to come in when we're being weak. And even within our own country, you had states taxing people, and you had farmers rising up and saying, we did not agree to these taxes. And so there was Shays' Rebellion. And so everywhere they looked, they said, this government's coming apart. It's only 11 years since we declared independence, and we're already falling apart. So we need to do something. So they did. And they're back in Philadelphia. Here we go again, back in Philadelphia. This time George Washington is there because he's not out fighting a war. And so he's helping to keep order, and he needs to really keep order because they're really mad at each other. There's Federalists who want a strong central government up against anti-Federalists who say, no, we don't want another strong government, we want strong state governments. And they're arguing, large states are arguing with small states. People are arguing over slavery. People are arguing over where to put the capital. Everything's going on. They're arguing and arguing. And so George Washington's trying to say, just calm down. Let's hear from each side. James Madison is the father of the Constitution, and he went in with some plans. He did some reading, he did some homework, he had some suggestions, and the neat thing he did is he took notes. And so we know about all the controversy, we know about all the arguments and all the things because James Madison took notes, which is a good thing. Now, so you have in your government packet, as you go down, it talked about the Articles of Confederation, and so you know that we have, let's see, we'll go back. So under the Articles of Confederation, you want to write down that it was a Congress, and so a way that we just talk about this is to say that it was an octopus with 13 arms and no head, because each of the states was going the way they wanted to go, and there was no organizing group that was saying, let's work together, let's have a plan, let's have a vision. They had no executive. And just like an executive in a company says, this is the way we ought to go, or here's what the people want done, let's do it. They needed to have something. And so the Articles of Confederation, there's your notes or information on that. So we know there's a Constitutional Convention. And in that Constitutional Convention now, we know that there were at least 3 compromises. The first compromise was large states versus small states. Large states wanted to have representation based on population because they would have more representatives and therefore more votes. We've got more power. The small states are saying, you can't do that. Everybody needs to be equal, otherwise we'll never get a say. And so they compromised. And the way they compromised is they gave them both what they wanted. The House of Representatives is based on population. The Senate is 2 each. Every state we have has 2 senators. And every state has at least 2 representatives. So Minnesota has 8. So stop and think. Is California going to have more representatives than us or less? Is North Dakota going to have more or less? Well, it depends on population, doesn't it? Now, so they have these 2 houses, but these 2 houses have to agree before anything is passed. And so understand that our Constitution from the very beginning was based on compromise. You have to have compromise. And that's what they expected to have happen. Now with slavery, Southerners, others understand that in some areas of the South, you had 5% of the people owned slaves, owned the other 95%. And so Southerners that in the South definitely wanted slaves to count, because in the House of Representatives, the more people you have, the more representatives you have, and so that's going to give the slave-owning people more representation, because they're not going to really give the slaves any say. Well, they wanted that, and people in the North are saying, wait. That's going to give you so much power, and so in that case, if you want to have the slaves count, you've got to pay taxes on them. You've got to pay their taxes. And the slave owners are saying, no, we don't want to do that. But we do want, you can't have it both ways. You can't count them as people one way and not count them as people another way for taxes, and then still not give them their rights as people anyway. And so the compromise, which is kind of a deal with the devil, it's kind of a strange compromise, was to say we're going to count the slaves, we're going to count 3/5 of the slaves. So 3/5 of your slaves count as population. But then 3/5 of your slaves count for taxes. And so it came to be called the 3/5 compromise, and it was to say that the slaves counted as 3/5. So if you're going to talk about all my slaves, I count 3/5 of them. Well, if you have one slave, then he's 3/5 of a person, which is really strange. But again, they didn't consider them people, they considered them property. And what we're finding is they're manipulating this to see, how can I get an advantage in this? Oh, I get an advantage if they're counted for population. So that's what they did. Or I get an advantage if they're counted for taxes. That's what they did. So again, they tried to compromise by saying, oh, okay, 3/5 of them count. So in terms of taking notes, slaves counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of population, representation, and taxes. They even argued about where to put the capital. Now, it's just like kids. They've got a good toy, and one kid says, this is mine, and the other kid says, this is mine. And finally, the mom and dad comes in and says, that's it. Nobody gets it. That's what happened here. The states are arguing, I want the capital, I want the capital. And finally, they just said, okay, we're going to carve out a place that's not part of any state. And it was kind of a swampy region, and it's kind of near where George Washington had his plantation. And since he was going to live at home and be president, since there was no place for him to be president, there was no capital built, he had it close at hand so he could kind of keep an eye on what was going on. So Washington, D.C. is not part of any state. But the city of Washington, D.C. has grown so that it has spilled out into Maryland and into Virginia. The other thing was, again, we had not, the United States of America now had all these war debts. And you remember that one man had managed to get a loan for $2 million that he had turned over to the Continental Congress, and they had never repaid him. And so there's all this debt out there, and they aren't paying it back, and so nobody will lend us any money. And so what they finally decided to do is to take all the debt, just like if you had a lot of credit card debt, and you took all your credit card debt and you put it into one thing. We call it consolidation. And you put it in one thing, so one bill, so that you can just pay it every month. And that's what they did. They centralized all the state debt, so there would be one big debt that they're going to work at and try to pay off. So that's it. So it helps. It ended up giving the states a little less control, and it gave the federal government a little more control. Now, when we look at ideas influencing the Constitution, the big ones are Greece, Rome, Christianity and Judaism are important, the Renaissance. The other ones, the things that are in the article that we talked about, were Rome and the Enlightenment and the British and the Americans. And so I can see I have to add that in here. That should be American. So Greece had the idea of democracy. Everybody should have a say. And since you had to pay money and you had to do a lot of things to be a citizen of Rome, there were a pretty small group. And you could actually go to the forum and you could talk to each other and decide. But when Rome captured Greece and captured Egypt and captured Palestine and eventually took over Great Britain, and it had all these far-flung places, they couldn't get everybody there. And so what they did is they had representatives. And so Greece gave us the idea of democracy. Rome gave us a way to do it, which was to have a republic, which means we have elected representatives. Okay, that's the big thing. Now, after that, we've got ideas like belief in one God came from Judaism, Christianity, talking about missionaries, belief in Jesus Christ, gold, God, and glory. Christianity was one of the big movers that got people to get out and explore. The Renaissance was kind of a rebirth after the Middle Ages. The people rediscovered pockets of education that had been in the monasteries or had been down in the Islamic nations where they had continued to do math and science and all these things like that. And so these new ideas are coming up and they're reborn and they're rethought about. Into that, and coming after that, came what was called the Enlightenment. And we talk about John Locke, and he had the idea that there were natural rights and that there should be, that governments should protect those natural rights. There was a man named Baron, I think it was de Montesquieu, And his idea was that there was a social contract, that we have a duty to do some of these things. And he also came up with the idea